If you love Review Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Houghton. I am so excited to do this podcast. It's one that I've wanted to do for absolutely ages. My dad fought in Malta during the Second World War and was shot down there during a dogfight. He was a Spitfire pilot. And the parallels of fighting there during World War II and the story that I'm about to tell you are remarkable. In fact, the people of Malta fought so gallantly during that war that they were awarded the George Cross, the highest civilian award ever given to a nation in recognition of their heroic resistance, when the island actually endured relentless bombings, naval blockades, and severe shortages of food and supplies by the Nazis. The George Cross was then incorporated into their national flag. The people of Malta inherited their ancestors' genes. That I have no doubt about whatsoever. So, picture a late medieval, early modern siege. Towering fortress walls damaged by heavy cannon, topped with soldiers, among them with guns loaded with chain shot, cannonballs literally connected by a chain, which when fired spins so fast, so fast, when it actually connects with a man or a horse, it hits them so hard, the body actually explodes. And this is what the besieging forces, the advancing forces, are up against. This is what they're facing as they try to take Malta. The attacking columns of infantrymen hold large shields above their heads to protect them from a plethora of things being fired and thrown at them from the walls. There's crossbow bolts, arrows longer than your arm. There's boiling water. There's boiling oil. There's large stones being thrown down on them. And of course, there's human feces. There is, of course, no protection from the cannon, and you just have to hope that on the day your luck is in. The attacking forces also push and pull the unwieldy but terrifying siege towers, many stories high, literally covered by gangs of men stripped to the waist, many of them slaves, roared on by burly sergeants, drawbridges ready to clatter down on the battlements. On the top level, sharpshooters provide cover with primitive firearms. To combat the threat of fire, siege towers were clad in soaking wet leather hides, with more water available on hand in casks to keep them nice and damp. It's a siege which pits two religions, ancient foes against each other, where prisoners are murdered, their mutilated bodies floated across waterways on crosses, a taunt to their Christian faith. Muslim prisoners in turn are beheaded. Their severed heads are fired back at their comrades from the barrels of the cannons. It's not just a siege, but an all-in struggle for a mighty fortress that seemed at the time to hold the key, the strategic balance of the entire region, a milestone in a centuries-long zero-sum struggle between sworn religious forces. The siege that I've described, it did actually happen. This is the Great Siege of Malta that took place in 1565. And if you can't picture what 25,000 screaming, armor-clad men rushing at you looks like, think about a crowd at a large music festival or a packed-out NBA game, but instead of cheering, they're charging at you fully armed. So for centuries, it was regarded as a definitive moment, a decisive moment in the Ottoman Turkish Muslim attempt to conquer all of Europe, and a moment of Christian resistance to that conquest. But I think, as you'll hear as we go through this in this podcast, that interpretation is actually now being questioned by historians. Although it was believed by many at the time and since, including, interestingly, by Queen Elizabeth I, who wrote about it as it was happening. She wrote, "If the Turk should prevail against the Isle of Malta, it is uncertain what further peril might follow to the rest of Christendom. And many people actually believed it was a battle for the future of Europe, even if that interpretation is now being questioned. What is not in doubt is the ferocity, the scale, and the intensity of the fighting that took place on that little island during that terrible summer. It is simply one of the most astonishing sieges in history, one that has come to define actually what we think of in our mind's eye when we actually hear the word siege. So, how much of a threat or perceived threat was the Ottoman advance through the Eastern Mediterranean? And I think the operative word there is perceived, because there was a disconnect between the realistic threat posed by the Ottomans to Western Europe and what Western European observers actually chose to believe, or at least, the rhetoric that they ramped up when trying to make a case. The reality was that the Ottoman Empire was a political organization in which military expansion was built into its DNA. That I have no doubt. But it also, at the time of the siege in the 1560s, was slowing down, or at least being a little bit more selective about the targets it was identifying. And I think Western European Christian observers tended to hark back to a more aggressive, expansive stage in Ottoman military history, kind of 20, 30, or 40 years before this fact, and assumed that there was something constant, permanent, about the way that the Ottomans live for relentless expansion. Therefore, I think the rhetoric surrounding the Great Siege is sometimes a little bit out of kilter with the reality of what actually took place. Which isn't to say that if you're on the ground in Malta in the middle of 1565, that you didn't feel yourself in the middle of an enormous, bloody great threat. But the way in which the Order of Malta itself and its Spanish overlords, tried to build up support to aid in the defense of Malta was to suggest that Malta was the first step in a grand Ottoman strategy, which would lead them to eventually the conquest of Sicily. They would work their way up through Italy, and ultimately then all of Western Europe was at stake. And here's the thing. I don't think that's even remotely feasible. And I think that people knew it. The Ottomans would have been hard-pressed to hold on to Malta had they actually won it during this siege, let alone contemplate, Sicily and Italy. I think they were attacking Malta as a bit of unfinished business. Their Sultan, Suleiman, was growing old. Malta and the Knights of St. John had been a thorn in his side for many, many decades, and he absolutely hated them. And I think this was the last bit of, let's deal with this persistent problem once and for all. I think that's what he really had in mind. And the fact is they failed, and they never really tried to come back to Malta, even though I think they could have perhaps taken it a year later because the defenses were completely destroyed. And that suggests ultimately that this really wasn't their major strategic goal. It was more of a kind of a vendetta. It was an old feud against the Order of St. John, and that was really what drove them. And the Order of St. John at the time of the siege had already been around for about 500 years. They were a venerable order of the Catholic Church, with their origins going all the way back to Jerusalem. And they had developed an interesting and unusual kind of two-facing personality. They were both a hospital order that cared for the sick and for the pilgrims, and they were a military order modeled on the order of the Knights Templar. And they were able to hold on to these two seemingly contradictory roles in a kind of creative tension. They were a socially top-heavy order, with the majority of their membership at the time of the siege. Certainly, there would have been about 1,400 knights, 1,400 knights at that stage, being the sons really of high-status aristocratic families, predominantly from Southern Europe. And under them, they would have had literally hundreds, if not thousands, of auxiliary personnel, sergeants, and priests. But demographically and in terms of kind of social importance, this was a very aristocratic, blue-blooded, elitist order. And there were also some nuns, but it was predominantly a mail order that prided itself on a tradition of resolute holy war on the frontiers between Christianity and Islam, which it inherited from, its early history. First on the mainland of Palestine and Syria, and then on the island of Rhodes, from which it had been ejected some 40 to 50 years before the siege. And in a sense, had that mandate rebooted just before the siege by the Great Reforming Council of Trent, the Catholic Church's attempt to react to the Reformation. And one small part of Trent's pronouncements had been to vindicate, to re-legitimize the vacation and the existence of the Order of St. John. So it was actually trying, if anything, to rediscover itself. It had taken a very big hit in the Reformation because much of Northern Europe, its properties and membership in much of Germany, in all of England and Scotland, had actually disappeared. It had been thrown back into a Romance-speaking Southern European core, and it had been given the islands of the Maltese archipelago when it had been evicted from Rhodes. It wasn't yet really convinced that Malta would be its permanent home, but nonetheless, the siege presented it with an opportunity to rediscover itself, to vindicate its historic sense of mission, if anything. And the way in which it celebrated its victory as they saw it after the siege and appealed for funds around Europe was built on this idea that the order was well and truly back in business. It had, for all intents and purposes, I guess it had discovered a kind of legitimacy and purpose which was in danger of ebbing away over the previous 2 or 3 generations. Effectively, they are now back in the business of holding back or driving back the forces of Islam. Okay, so they've been given Malta and the surrounding islands to run. I mean, they're a religious oligarchic state, and I think oligarchic is exactly the right word to use for them. Like all ultimately medieval religious orders, it had, I guess, an incredibly elaborate constitution and hierarchy, but essentially it was an oligarchy of old men based in Malta in which the Grand Master, a crazy kind of autocratic figure, a monarch, effectively, surrounded by the equivalent of a privy council. And although there were sometimes, rumbles of discontent, from the ranks of the knights, sometimes they were serious, but by and large, it was actually run as an autocracy or oligarchy, perhaps. In the interests of performing this mandate, it was ultimately answerable to the Pope. But on Malta, it was in a funny position because it had been given the Maltese Islands by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, in his capacity actually as King of Spain. And therefore, the order was to some extent beholden to the Spanish monarchy at the time of the siege. And the expectation was that it would be the Spanish king, by then actually Philip II, if Malta was to be saved. And that being the case, who would then galvanize the resources to fight the Ottomans? So I've mentioned Suleiman the Magnificent, and he's been ruling over the Ottoman Empire with an iron fist. He's the one who marched to the gates of Vienna. He's conquered all sorts of territory in Southeast Europe and a plethora of islands in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's actually really important for us to remember the Ottomans were an extraordinary maritime power and one of the great strategists of all time. So earlier on, I mentioned the vendetta, and I think the Ottomans kind of dress it up as a holy war. That was always a gambit that was available to them to lead a holy war against the infidels because they are so powerful. But in reality, I think the siege was an exercise in clearing house, as I mentioned, So the Knights of St. John, or the Knights of Malta, were, amongst other things, part of a culture of corsairing in the whole of the Mediterranean. Corsairs were, at least by their own lights, kind of licensed, acceptable pirates. And they were pirates who had effectively been given license to both capture shipping or to raid coasts and take slaves. Slavery was actually one of the big stories of the 16th century Mediterranean. And the capturing of ships, for they were, valuable assets, was the other. And the Knights of St. John did it. as indeed, many other coastal powers in the Mediterranean and along the North African coast did just that. I mean, a little bit later on, the British were also experts at it. And depending on who Great Britain was at war with, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, the British did it successfully for over 350 years. The Knights of St. John, although they were quite a small naval operation, they punched way above their weight. As a collective group, they knew the Eastern Mediterranean like the back of their hands, and they had been based at the island of Rhodes for a long time. So, two things happened to the Austrian Empire in the generation just before Suleiman came to power. The most important was that Suleiman's father, Salim, had taken what is now Syria and Palestine, and crucially Egypt, from the Mamluk regime, which was actually in decline. And this was a game changer, perhaps the single most important fact in 16th century world history. And you know what? I'll put the discovery of the Americas underneath this, because it was the Ottoman Empire access to the wealth of Egypt in itself, but also the access to the wealth that came up through Egypt, up through the Red Sea. The spice trade from the Indian Ocean and beyond. This made the route between Alexandria, the port from which all this spice trade came, and Istanbul, of course, a vital maritime link to the Ottoman world. Also, that same conquest, which extends into parts of Arabia, gave the Ottomans control of the holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina. And that gave them the responsibility for supervision of the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that devout Muslims are expected to take at least once during their lifetime. And more importantly, the responsibility to protect pilgrims in the early to mid 1560s. And it was about this time that the Knights of St. John had actually pivoted from, the grandiose schemes of kind of territorial expansion to a more realistic marshalling of their resources towards their corsairing, naval activities. And they had recently captured valuable Ottoman cargo vessels traveling between Alexandria and Istanbul. And they had severely disrupted the movement of pilgrims by sea on their way to the holy places. These activities threatened the Ottoman regime, both financially, but also in terms of its ideology and its prestige and its ability to protect its people. So I think it was in this capacity as kind of glorified pirates that the Order of St. John were attacked by the Ottomans. They were just an annoyance, but they were a deadly annoying threat. It was a double whammy of threat of both money and image as far as the Ottoman regime were concerned. So this is an imperial policing action. It's definitely not the first step to a great expedition to conquer the rest of the Western European world. It's actually a very realistic kind of hard-headed impulse. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we are back. Suleiman is aging. He has been too generous to the order, when he actually let them go from Rhodes, when they retreated from Rhodes, when he captured Rhodes from them in 1523. And since then, they've just been a pain in his side. So I think he's sitting back there saying, why not have one last push to be rid of them? That being said, I don't think the Ottomans really knew what to do with Malta anyway. And keep in mind, I really don't think that this was a Malta invasion. And I think even if they had won this battle, I think they would have abandoned Malta because it would have cost them too much in men and money to maintain. But what they would have had is the satisfaction of ridding themselves of this pesky thorn in their flesh. So Suleiman decides to send a huge force to deal with this annoyance. a massive amphibious force. He sends a fleet of 170 frontline galleys, another 50 or 60 smaller craft and cargo ships, which delivers effectively 25 to 30,000 frontline troops to Malta. That's a massive number, and certainly far more than the defenders had available to them. However, compared to the sorts of numbers that the Ottomans would have been able to throw against the Habsburgs of Austria in Central Europe or against their Iranian rivals in Anatolia, this is actually quite a small army. But as an amphibious force, it's enormous. And that in itself is an indication that this wasn't just a gestural effort. Let's see if we can get lucky kind of effort. That's an enormous amount of manpower that's being invested certainly in terms of ships and materials and of course men. The trouble was that to get those 25 to 30,000 frontline troops there, the majority of which I might add were elite janissaries or sahassaries, the two corps that represented the frontline troops of the Ottoman military machine. These guys were hardened warriors, but to get them there, you had to have a lot of people rowing the galleys. And of course, they then could perform various auxiliary roles. For instance, they could drag cannon around when the Ottomans needed it. They could build the fortifications. But in a sense, the Ottomans were condemned in a way to take a lot of non-combatants to the island with them, where they would also use up precious food and water on what's actually a very small, barren, dry island. So in a way, the clock was running from the moment that they arrived off Malta. They couldn't afford to stay there for long. And in May 1565, they were committed to a campaign on this very small island with very few resources. There were no crops, they couldn't live off the land, and they would have to bring their basic supplies in from both North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. And they were always vulnerable. This was a campaign on a very tight clock, for all of the reasons that I just mentioned. And the fact that they ran this bloody, brutal campaign for 4 months is a testament to their expertise in logistics and organization, if truth be told, which actually often gave them the advantage over their Western European rivals. And if truth be told, most European governments were highly insufficient. Money would get lost in transit, supplies would disappear, and people would just disappear into the desert with them. The question was, how well could you do while trying to mitigate those effects of that inbuilt inefficiency? And the Ottoman Empire definitely developed systems that reduced their own inefficiencies compared to their European rivals. So the net end effect was that they could organize themselves to contemplate something like the Siege of Malta, even though they were at their operational end of their range, especially with the galleys, especially as summer is kind of coming to an end. And keep in mind also that back in those days, few armies were able to fight in winter. But that being said, if anyone's going to do it, I honestly believe that they were the only people that could have done it. And the fact that they did this, that they attempted this siege that lasted for 4 months, is a testament to their powers of organization and sheer persistence. So the Ottomans get a foothold on Malta, and then I wondered how the campaign actually takes shape. So at that stage, there were 4 defensive positions on Malta. And when you think of a siege, you actually usually only think of an attack against one entity, be it a castle or be it a town. But Malta was more complicated than that. So the Knights of St. John and various Spanish troops and Italian troops who had actually either been given to them by the Habsburgs or been paid for by them. And of course, there was also a very large number of Maltese volunteers who were actually tasked with defending 4 main positions. St. Elmo, which was one of them, actually fell, but they managed to hold on to the other 3. That's actually a great victory for the defenders. So 3 of those great positions were clustered around the harbor area of Malta. And if you've been to Malta, you will be very familiar with them. From the modern city of Valletta, which was then just a bare rock peninsula, you would have St. Elmo at the tip of that peninsula, and then the twin peninsulas perpendicular to you would be Birgu and Sengila. and they're actually pointing towards you. Those are the three grand harbour fortified positions. The fourth was in the interior of the island, in the ancient capital of Dina, which was threatened at times, but it wasn't on the front lines, not like the Grand Harbour was. And keep in mind, for the Ottomans, this was an amphibious campaign, and they had to keep their navy and their ground forces as close as possible. And so they focused their attack on the main harbour, where most of the Order of St. John had gathered. So it was a siege of 4 places at varying times with varying levels of intense fighting. 1 fell, as I mentioned, and 3 held out. So St. Elmo Falls, it was the weakest point. Its value was that it guarded the Grand Harbour and its sister harbour on the other side of the peninsula. And if it fell, the Ottomans would be able to bring their fleet into Marsham Sheet and have their fleet close at hand to where the attacks were actually taking place on land. And in all fairness, and I can't even imagine how they did this, they held out at St. Elmo for 5 weeks, taking a formidable bombardment. But the longer they held out, and this was the important thing, they were buying more time for the defenders in the other fortresses to improve their defenses. And at the end of the day, there was something like 20,000 cannon shots to have been found in and around St. Elmo's walls. The good news for the Order of St. John is that in that 5 weeks, a great number of their frontline troops, the Janissaries, were actually killed in that operation. So by the time they swung around to Grand Harbour and began Stage 2 against the peninsulas of Birgu and Sengila, their frontline troops were depleted. And this made the difference in the long run by far. And what that actually means for the Ottomans is that in the frontline killing zone, they actually lacked the experience of their veterans. So when St. Elmo falls, there are terrible atrocities. And I then wondered if there was a religious element to that. And is it bloodier and more horrific than the fighting between the Christian powers going on in Europe at that time? And the answer is yes. What happens when St. Elmo finally falls is the Ottomans visibly desecrate the bodies of the Knights of the Order of St. John. And in doing so, they're sending a very succinct message and raising the bar to alter the mood music. The knights that fought in St. Elmo frustrated them. They embarrassed them. And they need to galvanize their own men. So they ramp up the language that is this holy war, knowing that the other side will happily respond in kind. Valle, who's the head of the Order of St. John, orders his cannon to fire the heads of the beheaded Turkish prisoners back at the Turks in a bloody war of tit for tat. And at that stage, you think, okay, maybe this is a holy war after all, because it's actually hard to imagine a knight of the Holy Catholic Order and an Ottoman Empire warrior coming to blows without that thought taking place. But after the violence of St. Elmo, that holy war rhetoric goes up a notch or two. So the Ottomans bring in 70 new cannon, and they start this campaign after St. Elmo falls of bringing all those cannon to bear on the other 2 peninsulas. And of course, while this is going on, there are ferocious infantry battles going on as well. The Christian sources actually call these the Great Assaults. It's wave after wave, often lasting up to 6 hours, of warriors picking their way through the rubble field, which their own artillery had created as they moved forward to kill the knights. And the first wave of men were usually sacrificed. This was a given, with the knights cutting them down. But the second wave, because the knights were tired and worn down, they would usually succeed. The Christian sources say that the Ottomans came in 9,000 men bursts. But in reality, I don't think that's possible. And I think they would have been coming in smaller parties, because you can't throw that many men against a rubble field, up an incline to where a wall had been just before. You have to do it in small groups. And it's a bit of a chess game. The defenders have to find ways to channel these successive waves into small killing zones where the disparity of numbers is going to be neutralized. But the knights were deadly when dealing with the smaller groups. And in further Christian sources, you can see that the numbers are actually being reported daily, and they're very accurate. They would say things like, we only lost 70 today, they lost 300 or 500. It doesn't actually matter that there were 10,000 Turks just half a mile away. It just matters to the knights how many people they could kill in that small killing zone, in that hour, in the next hour, and then finally by the end of the day. And look, based on the research that I've done, the Ottomans actually come very, very close to victory on numerous occasions. The margins were actually very fine. You know, the attitude of Jean de Valette, the Order's Grand Master, was what saved them. You know, he actually made up a flying squad of some 50 men, and he positioned himself with them where, when there was a weakness in defense, where the Ottomans were about to break through, he and his flying squad would rush to their aid. And ultimately, that's what saved them. And you can only view this as heroic acts of desperation. He had also given orders that he shouldn't be taken alive, and that if he had to sacrifice himself to save the day, to kill 2 more Ottoman, so be it. The very fact that he recorded after the event that he nearly died on at least 3 occasions tells me that the defenders were just very, very brave and incredibly lucky. And sometimes, you know, folks, that's exactly what you need. Bravery and luck on your side at the same time. The other interesting thing is the siege warfare at this time was also kind of punctuated by plague, and I found this really intriguing. Defenders at this stage, wherever a siege was going on, were usually always weakened by disease. And there is evidence in this particular fight that disease raged through the Ottoman camp, but none of it affecting the defenders on the inside. That was also very telling. The knights were able to preserve their water supply. You know, that was never actually damaged by the Ottoman bombardment. And although they ran low at times, it never ran out. And that would have been an absolute game changer. And they also never run out of gunpowder. And at one stage, near the end, not that they knew it was near the end, but near the end, they actually catapulted a mine at the Ottomans just to show off, just to say, you know what, keep on coming, we're still well equipped. Then at one stage, one of the Ottoman powder mills blew up at sea, and it was rumored, and this may be true or it may not, that a knight had actually swam under cover of darkness a mile out to sea to that powder ship and sabotaged it. And the Christian sources actually allude to that fact, but no one particular knight is named. On the knight side, they were actually able to produce gunpowder in some quantities right to the end, and those are the little things that make a difference. It's kind of shocking in a way to think that the Ottomans would have died because of disease, because of terrible disease, because of, the misunderstanding really of how to maintain clean water and to deal with the consequences of all the waste product that's actually produced by an army of, 30,000 men, this massive army. And what shocks me about that is that more men actually died through disease than were probably killed by Christian shot and steel. The sad irony, I think, is that the Ottoman forces, the army in particular, had a worldwide reputation for being far more attentive to matters of hygiene and medical care than any Western army in existence. They were way ahead of the game. But even they couldn't mitigate being forced to live and fight on a cramped island with very little water. And unfortunately, back in those days, once disease takes hold in those sorts of situations, inadequate medical science, it cannot be stopped. But the Ottomans, in fairness, were always an object lesson in the other wars, in every other war that they fought. They gave superior attention to matters of hygiene and medical care. And that's one of the important reasons. That's one of the reasons that they were so successful over centuries of time. So, what brings the siege to an end? Well, I think there's 2 things. The headline is that finally the forces of the Habsburg Europe, especially in those parts of Italy which were under the control of the Habsburg kings of Spain, are able to call together a coalition of forces which are effectively a relief force known as the Grand Relief. And they're a force of about 9,000 strong, and they land on Malta in early September 1565. And they meet the Ottoman forces in a running battle in the center of the island, and they force them back to their ships. And the survivors of that bloody day board the Ottoman galleys and they sail off. And this is stuff that we know because it's written in the Christian sources. However, you know me, I question all these things and I dig deeper. I think in reality, there is actually evidence that the Ottomans were already beginning to disengage from Malta even before the Grand Relief arrives. The defenders were starting to see them take down their gun emplacements and to withdraw to more distant positions. And I think in reality, the Ottomans would have had to, even if the Grand Relief had never happened, they would have had to have made a decision. We do it tough over the winter, which I think would have been almost impossible, or we withdraw. And I think what we're seeing here as the Grand Relief arrives is them withdrawing. Don't forget also that the siege took place before the Great Reform in the Christian calendar, the result of which was that, when we think of the siege ending in the first half of September 1565, in meteorological terms, that is actually the equivalent to late September, early October. So they were pushing closer to worsening weather conditions, and they had only provisioned for a summer offensive. And I think what happened then was that the Grand Relief arrives and provides that final push. I don't ultimately think it was the reason why the siege ended. I think the siege was ending as that relief force arrives. So their survival and a victory for the defending side. And one of the great sieges of history, certainly in its intensity and its drama. So the next question is, does it actually matter? Does it leave a big strategic imprint on history? Look, I happen to think it's very important, but I think its importance is symbolic rather than strategic. When the knights finally regroup, they decide to build now what is the modern capital of Malta, Valletta, and that takes place at this stage. And here's the thing, I don't think that would ever have happened had that attack never happened. And what the knights then do is they build this siege into their mythology, claiming that they have actually become what they call the bulwark of Christianity or the bulwark of Europe. And this was a phrase that they bandied around a lot. We were the front line defending Europe as a whole from the Ottoman menace. This plays to everything that they're about. But I think it was largely a rhetorical posture. Once Valletta had been built, and the defenses of Malta enormously improved, the chances of the Ottomans trying to restage events of 1565 are really, really slim. Of course, over the ensuing centuries, there were scares, there were invasion scares, right into the 17th century. But I think the chances of the Ottomans trying again, well, their opportunity, their one and only opportunity, was a year after the siege, while the defenses were still incredibly weak. After that, not a chance. And the other thing to keep in mind is that after the siege, most of the knights were actually dead. So the Ottomans a year later actually missed their chance. But then they start to rebuild. And I think it actually achieves a lot of its longer-term resonance by being twinned with the Battle of Lepanto, kind of 6 years later. It becomes the first part of a kind of double act, a 1-2, if you like, which demonstrated that finally, kind of Western European, Mediterranean Europe was actually able to organize itself to meet the Ottomans on equal terms, if not better. And I think the Great Siege benefits from being linked to Lepanto and thereby assumes the significance which I suppose in isolation it probably didn't deserve. And of course, I know there's going to be a lot of historians out there that disagree with me, but that's my thought. In real strategic terms, its symbolic importance was enormous, and that's important. I mean, look, it is fair to see the twins of Lepanto, a great naval victory, won by a Christian alliance off the coast of Greece. But I wonder if they were right to say that this represents a new chapter in Mediterranean history. The era of slow grinding advances by the Ottomans, say, has it come to an end? And is it fair to see the Great Siege and Lepanto together like that? Interestingly, the most famous victim of the Corsairs around this time at Lepanto was Miguel Cervantes. Yes, the author of Don Quixote. And he actually fell at Lepanto. He was badly injured at Lepanto. And he writes that although he had personal reasons to look back, regretfully on Lepanto, because he actually lost the use of one of his hands, he wrote that it was the day when Christian Europe regained its confidence, and that Christians learned not to be afraid of the Ottomans ever again. He actually wrote that some decades later. So I think, yes, I think the siege was an important battle in history. The Ottomans actually remained active in the central and western Mediterranean for 10 or more years after Malta. But eventually they and the Habsburg kings of Spain, they realized that they're being sucked into, a very expensive arms race that neither of them really needed or wanted. Both of them wanted to engage elsewhere and to divert resources away from the Mediterranean. And so by about 1580, the tension there between the two is dying down, which is to say that the Mediterranean doesn't become a safe place. The culture of corsairing is still there, and it reemerges in a way after the great powers are partly withdrawn from the central Mediterranean. Malta is the last moment in this decisive change, but it is a single moment in a process whereby, the two great powers of the 16th century Mediterranean, the Ottomans and the Spanish Habsburgs, eventually agree to disagree, to draw rough lines of demarcation, and I think to more or less just leave each other alone, or at the very least, to allow themselves to pursue a war through kind of small surrogates. The Order of St. John on Malta and the various North African corsairs in what is now Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, over which the Ottomans had some kind of overlordship, but were ultimately left to do their own thing, to make a living from corsairing. And another indication of that is from about 1580, you see the beginnings, and this is really important, of Northern European traders, the English and the Dutch, muscling their way into the Mediterranean to kind of pick up the spice trade from the ports in the east. And muscling for these two countries is light work because they are heavily armed. They fight off the corsairs easily while also, managing to displace the Venetians, the historic carriers of the spice trade. So you get the sense that the Mediterranean is now being plugged into a larger global economic circuit. And the Ottomans at the other end begin or develop systems to tap more effectively into the spice trade, coming through from the Indian Ocean. So in reality, the Mediterranean is no longer the center of attention. It's simply one important part of a much larger global circuit, a much larger movement of goods in which now there are many different players. The Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, the English and the Dutch in the Atlantic, and they're all starting to be much more kind of joined up. And in that sense, the siege was one of the last hurrahs of an older world in which people fought over the Mediterranean for itself. And suddenly then, it becomes part of this much larger joined up world, and Malta changes forever. The ancestors of which won the George Cross in a war that my father flew and fought in some 500 years later. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure talking about Malta, and I look forward to chatting to you again next week. Bye for now.